Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Recently took some new people to the range, and so I thought I'd do a video on this topic because it's an area where there's a lot of confusion. So I'm going to cover some of the legal issues as well as some of the practical issues involved with this. One question people often have is simply, can I take new shooters to the range, people who may not have a firearms license yet? And they might be asking this either as the firearms license holder who wants to bring somebody along, or as somebody who is curious and wants to learn about guns, or it might be considering getting a firearms license, but would like some actual experience before they go through the hassle and the expense of getting a license. So the short answer is yes, this is possible. But let's have a look at the law here in terms of what it allows and how it works. So unauthorized possession of firearm. Subject to subsection 4, every person commits an offense who possesses a prohibited firearm, restricted firearm, or a non-restricted firearm without being the holder of, first, a license under which the person may possess it, and in the case of a prohibited firearm or restricted firearm, a registration certificate. So as a starting point, if you hand somebody a rifle, that would be, they're committing a crime and you're committing a crime. However, there is a big exception here. It doesn't apply to a person who possesses a prohibited firearm, a restricted firearm, a non-restricted firearm, etc., 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 while the person is under the direct and immediate supervision of a person who may lawfully possess it for the purpose of using it in a manner in which the supervising person may lawfully use it. So there's a couple of major caveats here. The first that I'll cover is a manner in which the supervising person may lawfully use it. What this is sort of intended to cover is that if I lend a friend a gun because we're going to commit a bank robbery together and I've got a license, well, he can't say, listen, we were robbing this bank under the direct and immediate supervision of this guy because I don't have any lawful ability to rob banks. They don't give licenses to rob banks. So that would not be covered. However, this does create the possibility for people to get into trouble if they might be acting outside of their authorizations. For example, let's say somebody has a prohibited firearm that, they're still allowed to own because they're grandfathered, but they're not allowed to take it to the range. Well, if you're not allowed to take that prohibited firearm target shooting, then you could get a guest into a lot of trouble if you brought them to the range with you because they wouldn't be covered by this. So don't do that. The next aspect, and this one, lots of people have questions. I've seen so many debates over this, but what does direct and immediate supervision cover? The short answer is this is not really clear. The gold standard in terms of, the best version of direct and immediate supervision would be something where you're like right up close and you could theoretically just reach out and grab them and stop them if they were doing something unsafe. But I'm not sure that's required. A lot of people say that's what's needed. However, there is case law where they have contemplated, for instance, two brothers or whoever out hunting together, one of whom has a license and the other does not, but they're both hunting so long as they're staying together and they're able to observe each other. So one case at least contemplates that as being direct and immediate supervision. Another context that comes up that leads me to think that, it doesn't necessarily need to be right directly connected. And again, it's unclear. The courts might rule that this is a different sort of scenario. But I think of movies because you'll have a movie armorer who is providing firearms to people on set who probably don't have firearms licenses. And if you think of Reservoir Dogs and sort of the tense scene, everyone's got a gun pointed at everyone else. Well, what do you not see in that scene? You don't see a movie armorer sitting in the background going, don't mind me. And they're not, green screening out the movie armorer. Lots of movies are filmed in Canada with firearms, and you don't see the armorer standing right next to the actor because of course not. That would be ridiculous. But I'm sure that armorer is on hand and watching and making sure everything is being done safely. So direct and immediate supervision probably extends beyond sort of hand grip. I can't say that for sure, though, because a court might decide that direct and immediate supervision varies depending on the activity. And again, this is purely hypothetical because there's not a whole lot of case law on this. But the court might say that you have to be closer at the range than you do hunting or at a movie. Ultimately, we don't know. I like to err on the side of caution and be fairly close, but not so close that I'm necessarily going to be eating brass or whatever else. But I do like to be sort of close enough that I can intervene if I think they're going to do something dumb. I don't really know what this means. Unfortunately, there isn't a clear definition. But we have some examples as well of things it probably isn't. And one example of something it definitely isn't is, for instance, me handing a rifle to a friend and wishing them luck as they head off into the forest to go shoot. That would not be direct and immediate supervision. The same case law that talks about two people hunting together talks about, well, what if they separate while they're hunting? Then it probably wouldn't be direct and immediate supervision. So that's sort of as best we can do in terms of figuring this out. Now, another question people often have is, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if I lend somebody a firearm, we're there and I'm trying to be under direct and immediate supervision, and let's say they do something unsafe. They turn around and they decide, some sort of, they have some sort of crazy decision and they fire into the air, for example. Well, depending on circumstances, you might potentially face charges. In theory, they could charge you with weapons trafficking if you did not supervise somebody. So if you handed somebody a rifle and then said, you shoot on this range, I'm going to go 2 ranges down and shoot there, then you might potentially be charged with weapons trafficking, which is a very serious charge. You don't want to get that. In theory, if if the person you're with does something dangerous, they might decide to charge you with careless use. That is debatable. It's hard to sort of necessarily know how a court would go. But certainly, if you were trying to supervise somebody and you were doing just a terrible job in supervising it, you weren't paying attention or you were allowing them to do dangerous things, the court would find something to charge you with. I have seen situations where somebody who is under the direct and immediate supervision has done something sort of shocking, and where the supervisor wasn't charged. These were circumstances where it was something surprising, something unexpected, and there was really no way to anticipate it. So you're going to be expected to exercise diligence and care in this. You have a responsibility, both legally and just morally and ethically, to make sure that this is done right. So that's sort of some of the legal issues that we can cover. I'll now move on and talk a little bit about the practical issues, because when you're bringing somebody to the range, there's a number of things you want to keep in mind. First, you want everything to be safe. You want everybody to go home with no extra holes that they didn't bring with them. And you want everyone to have a good time. I mean, it sort of goes without saying that if you're bringing somebody to the range, you should want them to enjoy the experience and to, get something out of it. At this point, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Paul Harrell already has an excellent video on this topic, which I'll try to link here. I don't think I disagree with anything he says in it. I have slightly different spins, in part because I'm talking about Canadian legal issues. There's not really a one true correct way to do this sort of thing. There's lots of wrong ways, but there's not sort of a one true proper way to go about it. So figure out what works for you that is safe and effective as a teaching method. The first thing I always like to do, but even before I get to the range, is talk to people about what they want to get out of things, because that is important. If somebody's only interested in shotgun shooting, maybe I'm not bringing the handguns out. When I was taking people out the other day, it was a bunch of law students. So what I wanted to do was bring a variety of different firearms so that they could experience a variety of actions, a variety of styles of shooting, and have a broader base of knowledge. So that is always helpful to know sort of what people want out of things. But when we get to the range, the first thing I want to do is stop and have a conversation. There's 2 reasons for that. The first is I want to go over the basic rules of firearm safety. And that's, even if I think they already know them, I still want to go over them. I also want to watch people and kind of gauge their attitude and how they're dealing with it. Most people at this point will be trying to pay attention and to take things seriously. Now, you may have some people with some anticipation, either because they're nervous or because they're really eager to get going. But if you've got somebody who can't put those things aside in order to pay attention to the safety sort of guidelines, I get concerned. And I will say, I have brought people out to the range and sent them home again right afterwards without ever actually taking them shooting. they're always upset and annoyed by this. But I'm not going to put a gun in somebody's hands unless I am confident that they can do so safely. So this, I think, is an important aspect. And, your basic firearm rules, in terms of always treat the firearm as loaded, because you can never be sure. And mistakes are made when people think something is unloaded and they're wrong. Never point the gun at anything you're not willing to destroy or anything you're not willing to shoot. Be aware of your target. Be aware of what's around your target. Be aware of what's behind your target. And of course, keep your finger outside of the trigger guard until you're ready to shoot. This is something that with every new shooter, you're going to have to watch them, because people screw this up all the time. And, I want to make sure that I know somebody is following this. So step 1 is go over all of that. Step 2 is really to discuss, and again, this is all just part of the conversation, some things about how to go about shooting, in terms of what makes a sight picture, that sort of thing. That way people are prepared when you start considering putting a firearm in their hands. Sometimes what I'll like to do is a bit of showmanship and lay out a bunch of firearms so that they can see sort of what I brought and get curious, but that's not necessary. It can sometimes be fun, however, and for both of you. However, I always like to start out with something pretty simple. And what I recommend here is a 22, because it's got very low recoil. It doesn't tend to sort of bother people. It's lower noise, and it goes without saying, never let somebody start shooting for their first time, or ever really, without proper eye protection and hearing protection. That's part of safety, both because, you don't want somebody to get injured in terms of an ear injury, but you also don't want them to pull the trigger and then go, ah, and swing a gun in an uncontrolled direction. That's unsafe. Don't do it. So the reasons why I like a 22, low caliber, it's light, low recoil, low noise. It's not so scary. And I always like to use some sort of manual action. One of the guns that I use pretty much specifically for training in this circumstance is a single shot Cooey 22. It's got a bolt action. You got to pull the hammer back manually, and it doesn't have a magazine. The reason why I love this is that sometimes you will get new shooters who have a really bad reaction, which is that they fire and then they immediately go, wasn't that cool? And they turn because they want to, share with you how cool this moment was, how excited they are. And that's great, but I don't want you turning while you still got the gun in your hands, because that's unsafe. At least with a single shot, I know that there isn't another one, in the pipe. I know that they're, and they can't reload without sort of me being able to observe it. It's a lot more difficult for them to load a single shot without, than it is to move a lever or a bolt. So that lets me let them take one shot and then discuss things with them and say, how did that go? How did that feel? And talk if they did anything unsafe. Did you turn? Did you anything like that? I'll try to interrupt if they are going to do that, but it interrupts the process. I don't like to give people as their first shot a semi-automatic, and I certainly never give people for their first shot a semi-automatic with more than one cartridge. I will, if I am using a semi-auto, I load one. I want to see how they do firing one, and then we'll move on. And that's just because it's really hard to predict which people are going to fire and then want to turn and talk to you, or they're going to set the gun down, but it's pointed down the line at the range, any of these kinds of things. So I always want to see that people are exercising safe practices before I start moving on to more rounds in the magazine or larger calibers or that kind of thing. This brings me to my next sort of cautionary note. And I usually hear this told as a joke, so I'm not sure how many people are actually doing this one, but don't be the person who brings your friend to the range and immediately hands them the gun that's got the biggest, nastiest, ugliest recoil out there. The old double barrel shotgun with just a metal butt pad. When people do that, the person firing it is going to then, it's going to hurt and it's going to be unpleasant. And that's a bad thing, because instantly you're teaching them bad habits. If this is the first time they're firing a gun, now they're afraid of it. And they're going to be, anticipating the recoil. They're going to be afraid to when they pull the trigger. So that's not good. The second thing is you're trying to teach this person safety, right? This is somebody who's coming to shooting with no prior experience. And so you're trying to build that up from, from a good foundation. You need them to trust you. You need them to understand that the stuff you're telling them is for their benefit. And you can't do that if you're setting them up to get hurt. You know, this is not a time for pranks. This is not a time for jokes. You're talking about a firearm. This is serious. So don't do that. It's also dangerous to other users of the range because, again, new person, they may not have the discipline to keep that firearm pointed down range when they're hurting. So I hate every time I hear somebody tell sort of a joking story along this line, and I recommend very strongly against this tactic. I always, again, start people off real small. The other thing is I always warn people when they're coming to the range to wear sort of, clothing that's appropriate. And appropriate in this, confines, it's not like you're going to a wedding or anything, but you want to make sure that you don't have any open collars or anything along those lines. Nothing that can catch hot brass. Brass, when it ejects from a firearm, it can be quite hot. And if it gets caught in between clothing and skin, it'll transfer all of that heat to you, which can cause burns. It can actually leave scars. So that's an unpleasant thing. Now, an experienced shooter might have the discipline, or should have the discipline, to keep that firearm pointed downrange, to set it down, and then deal with the problem. But a newbie, you don't necessarily know what they're going to do. And I don't want somebody to be flailing because they're in pain because of, an accident. So I often bring a scarf or something along those lines so that if somebody has dressed, they've got the big open collar or something, you can wrap that up. And so make sure that that's not an issue. Also be wary, and this is one that's easy to miss, when people are shooting from a prone position. If their pants right up and they've got the plumber's crack going on, well, that can catch brass too. And I will tell you, if, it's never happened to me, but I'm pretty sure if you've got hot brass in between your cheeks, that's going to wreck your day. So always be mindful of that. If you've got a new shooter who's laying down prone, I mean, you're not checking them out, but make sure they're going to be safe. Make sure they're going to be okay. Keep an eye on them. All right. So these are just some pointers that I try to follow here. And I always also like to have a little debrief afterwards to talk to people, find out what they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy. That'll help you for the next time. And also they might have questions. They might want to know things. They might want to schedule another time. They might want to be, hey, let's go again. And next time, could we spend more time with the shotgun or whatever else? So I'm also going to once again say, the Paul Harrell video, as noted, is in more depth, and he's put a lot of thought into it. He's got a lot of experience, so I recommend it if you haven't already watched it. Anyway, those are sort of my thoughts. If you have any questions, if you have any, if you think I got something wrong here, because sometimes people do, let me know in the comments below. I'll try to address them. I may end up doing a follow-up video if that becomes a thing. So thank you. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this to be interesting. I hope it's answered some of the questions that are floating around out there. Please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Subscribe to see more content. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level: Jonathan Wheeler, Jason Elliott, Canada's National Firearms Association, Kyle Martin, Jean-Guy Toussaint, Ivo Nedev, the CCFR, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Marc-Olivier Damour. And at the $20 level, Matt Ward, Mark Whittington, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, and Andrew Elsich. I also want to thank everyone at the $10 level who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge.